Wow, welcome everybody to another episode of Cosmic Corner, only on Faith Unaltered. So many apologies for the delay. Um, Life is a very strange place, but here we are. Thankful to be here. With me again, Jaylen. Welcome, bro. So excited. This is going to be fantastic time. It's going to be nice to just have a, slow one-on-one. I think this is going to be really fun, actually.
I think so. At some point you got to start welcoming me as well, because I don't know if you want to go ahead and drop the bomb here or.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, that's that. Let's do it. I am pleased that Jaylen has decided to continually join me as officiated as a co-host for Cosmic Corner, and I am very thankful to you for your willingness and for your involvement. It's really cool to have somebody join in and believe in a project and come alongside somebody, and this is something that's been really fun to do, but it's very difficult and very heavy to do alone, and so I experience a great sense of relief to have somebody that is aiming in the same direction, and I don't feel like I'm trying to make this crazy train make sense by myself. So welcome officially, Jaylen, as co-host, other half of Cosmic Corner. I officially need to redo my intro video now to include you. I just realized.
Yep, that is true. Yeah. So for those who don't know, I have joined the Faith Unaltered team as a co-host. Josh and I are going to be working together on Cosmic Corner. Just FYI, the Identity Crisis podcast is still up. It's still a YouTube channel, and it's actually going to get formatted into a playlist that will be on the Faith Unaltered channel. It's still going to be going. Right now, what I'm trying to do is and thank you, Terry. But what I'm going to be trying to do here is kind of establish myself as a presence here on the Cosmic Corner channel, as well as Faith Unaltered episodes as well. And we're going to continue in this space. Nothing wrong with Dylan and I. I know that people may know me from working with Dylan. Dylan's in a great space. I was just on the phone with him last night, actually. We're in a great space. Dylan just felt like it'd be best for him right now to focus on his family, growing family. And so that's what we got going on, man. And so I'm here to help, and we're gonna build something here, and hopefully it glorifies God, and hopefully He's pleased.
And hopefully we're pleased too, because it's a lot of fun to do something like this. It really is. Like,
yeah, right.
I know that it probably looks fun, but it's honestly like more fun than it looks most of the time. To have these conversations, like it's a trip, and it is a genuine privilege to be connected with some of the guys that have joined me for what I call the Cosmic Crew, and it is a trip to see the way this has come together and the way God has aligned so many things that, like, oh man, yeah. So I'm excited for what God has for the future, because I couldn't have brought this project to where it is just on the steam of my own interest. God's obviously doing something with it, and man, I'm here for it. So
I hear you there. I'm the same way with the Identity Crisis podcast. I have no idea. Unless God be involved, I got zero idea how it got to where it is now, and how I ended up here with you. Me. I couldn't make this up.
Well, I reached out because I like you.
That's the first.
Pray for me.
Right.
So first of all, welcome. This is my older sister, by the way. So she's very pleased that I found somebody that'll come alongside me with this, but she seems to like you a lot, genuinely. So
thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. It's nice to be liked.
She's an exceptionally spunky, fun older sister, and she does a good job protecting me, and so she definitely cares enough to know, but
that's
but
awesome.
I was with her earlier this week and had a lot of fun visiting with my aunt and uncle, who I don't see very often at all because they don't live in America. They live in Fiji as church planting.
Yeah, you told me about this.
Yeah, it's very cool to have seen them, but it was also very cool to just be able to spend a Monday with my mom and my sister, kind of driving around doing stuff. It's a really nice day. It was a good week. But
Yeah,
it was
that's
a
awesome.
fun week. So bless the Lord that we're here. The week is almost over, and here we are. So the topic for tonight is going to be one that I hope we can pull off without shooting ourselves in the foot. One of the things that makes it such a firebox to try to deal with is the prevalence of the topic in the political sphere and in the, let's say, uncouth underbelly of several different ideologies that aren't in the political sphere, but we know are just waiting for people's attention.
Yep.
There's no shortage of evidence that people have approached this question wrongly, let's say,
Sure.
or at least haphazardly. Most of them very ignorantly. And so what we don't want to do is try to use a broad brush and speak politically and trigger a bunch of people. I don't think that's my intent. I don't think that's Jaylen's intent. So just a disclosure here, we're going to talk about a topic that is very difficult, and we're going to talk about it in a way that doesn't rely on political agenda or alignment. I'm sure certain facets of that will come up naturally because of its prevalence there, but we aren't going to be having a political discussion.
Right.
That being said, I'm kind of curious if you have any like forethought as to how you want to kind of open up the discussion, because usually what I do is a kind of like 10,000 foot view, zoom out, define the thing, and then zoom in to explore. This is a little bit different. And so I kind of want to open it up and see if you have any, like anything that's been lingering in the back of your mind that you think is a good open door for the some of the things that we've discussed on this behind the scenes.
I don't. I kind of like the idea of starting at 10,000 feet and then zooming in.
Okay.
Especially even with a topic like this, I know it's touchy. I know you didn't necessarily say, what the topic was, which is we're going to be talking about racial identity, right?
Right.
And I'll say before we get started, while I don't have too many personal dealings with you, Josh, I fashion myself to be a decent judge of character. And from what I've detected about you, is you're a person of high character and high integrity. So
Thank you.
what I don't want you to feel like is because of the pigmentation of your skin, that you are not in a position to speak on this topic. I don't think you feel that way, but I want to say that to you before we get started. That as a brother in Christ, as a fellow disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ, your thoughts and your opinions are valid. They are worth listening to in this regard, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And it's okay to say what you have to say, because I know that what you say is going to be well thought out. It's going to be well articulated. It's going to be clear and concise. And it's also going to be God honoring. And so, I don't want you to feel like, hey, I better, prance lightly around this topic. You don't have to. Just honor Christ.
Fair, and I appreciate that. Like,
Yeah.
after the day I've had, I honestly could. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Well, bless the Lord. I appreciate the willingness to address something like this to begin with.
Yeah.
I know it's probably a little weird for somebody to spend, let's say, the second episode with you acting officially as co-host to be like, hey, let's talk about the ugliest elephant in the room. I think that it's good though, because there's something to be said about the lack of presence for this topic in the apologetics world, because it
Yeah.
seems like pastors and priests and apologists don't want to touch this topic with a 10-foot pole unless it's for the sake of a political candidate or ideology. And there's very little being said other than a kind of hand waving, we don't see color kind of sentiment. And it
Sure.
doesn't do anything productive to do that. There's something to be said about saying, stop making a central focus of something, and it won't be such a in your face sort of thing. I've heard people anytime I've mentioned that I was going to have this conversation, I've had people mention it's what's his name? My brain is blanking. The guy who does all the narration, what's his name? He does a lot of narration for movies. He played God on Bruce Almighty.
Morgan Freeman.
Morgan Freeman. There you go. I remember seeing a video 10 years ago or something like that of him being interviewed, and everybody was talking about, you know, whatever kind of flavor of the week event that was happening that brought people's attention back to racial issues. And his sentiment was, you know, he was asked, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? How do we stop this from being the biggest problem in our face? And his response was, stop talking about it. If you stop putting a spotlight on it, then it won't get the attention that it has.
Sure.
To some degree, I think that's wisdom, because I don't think that it should be a central facet of everything we talk about, everything we think about, and all of those things. It shouldn't be permeating everything that we do. And when it is, it makes itself an obvious idol, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the same line of thinking, if we avoid something that we know is a problem, the medical world will tell you really quickly that that doesn't solve the problem. If you have a cancer in your body and you say, I just won't look at my left arm, I won't think about that, I won't talk about that, I won't address that, it won't go away.
And eventually it'll spread to your right arm.
That's exactly right. And so a lot of the time, this is how extremist groups work. And this is how extreme views work. If we decide that we don't want to look at them, we decide that we don't want to talk to them, and we decide that we need to quiet everyone who brings it up, only the people who you don't want anyone to listen to are going to be the people that talk about it.
Right.
The very people that you don't want anybody to hear out on it are the people that are going to be heard.
And that'll be the prevailing narrative and understanding that gets spread amongst the masses who will listen to them. And even those who don't want to listen to them, they will be forced to listen to them.
Right, exactly. And you actually validate the voice because there's nothing against it. There's nothing to counter it. Right. This is one of the things. This is why I hate that there's a void for this in the apologetics world, because of the fact that if the only discussion that we can possibly have surrounding racial identity is one of politics and social expectation or social construction or whatever other buzzwords that might surround this topic, then there isn't going to be a solid leg to stand on for those people who are in the church who are trying to be ready to give an answer for something like this. Right? Not that this is a central facet of apologetics, but boy, it can't exactly be brushed under the rug, especially because of the fact that racial diversity is genuinely on the rise in our country. And it looks like within the next probably 10, 20 years, white isn't going to be a majority anymore. And so there's going to be a point at which that kind of starts tipping. And before you get there is when you're going to get people that are going to start being like, oh, this is good, we should foster it along, or oh, this is bad and we should avoid it. But there's not really much in between where people can make sense of how to approach something like that. You know what I mean? And so
I agree with you 1000%. And I think also part of the issue here is, like you said, if we just make it a conversation that's had within the context of a social construct or a societal construct, and or the political sphere, we are standing. We're building a house on sand here in terms of our understanding of racial identity and racism and whatnot. If all we relegated to is the political arena and the social arena, societal arena, where at best our epistemological understanding of things is flimsy, we will never ever view this thing in its proper context. If we fail to try to connect this racial identity in some way, shape, or form to its fundamental essence in regards to image bearers of the image, we'll never get anywhere with this conversation. These conversations will continue to be unproductive, fleeting emotionally, and temporary in terms of their satisfaction for any given moment, given whatever circumstances going on at a particular time.
So with that, I think that's what I was looking for, was I think that's right. The right open door. If anybody's ever watched any episode of Cosmic Corner ever, you know that I make a huge deal out of the image of God. I think that this is one of the single most neglected doctrines in the Western world. And it breaks my heart because it has such a depth of utility and answer. It has so much explanatory power, and it has such meaning and value. And it honestly answers most of the undue difficulty that we have, especially in the political arena, surrounding identity. Identity is a huge part of the conversation that is going on in the social sphere, especially online and in the political world. And identity is something that I've tried to address in as many different avenues and facets as possible, while being fair to the strange ambiguity of being an individual, while also acknowledging that being an individual doesn't make you completely disjointed and disconnected, utterly distinct from the rest of the mass of humanity. You're still human. You do still share your humanity, and in some sense, you share much of your humanity with everyone else, right?
Yes.
And so that kind of thing, I think, is a good starting place. We've talked about identity quite a lot, but one of the things that we haven't talked about, obviously, is racial categories, because it's not something that, for me, plays a central facet, right? But again, to go out of our way not to ignore it, I think, is wisdom. And so let's start by the 10,000 foot view and talk about what is race, right? We can talk about the human race, right? Humans as distinct from the rest of biological, organic life on the planet or off the planet, however you want to parse that out. If you believe in aliens, that's another conversation that I haven't had with you, Jaylen, but we'll save that one. We'll table that for a second. How would you define what race is, and maybe not where does it come from, but why do you think that it is the thing that it is right now?
Sure. So I think that it's that important to define terms, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with my understanding of the term race. The way that I've always understood is there's always been one race, and that's the human race. However, we can break that race down into ethnicities, and that's where you can get your African American, your African, your Caucasian, your European, your Hispanic, so on and so forth. But for whatever reason, we've replaced race in our understanding of it as there being one race, the human race. We've replaced that with ethnicities, and we've turned the ethnicities into the one race that we are supposed to see things through. And I think I don't think it's been said like that out loud, but it certainly is the case. And we're seeing the societal the fallout and the impact on society from viewing people in those types of ways, where the first thing I have to acknowledge about you is your ethnicity. And by acknowledging your ethnicity, I'm also acknowledging inherent personality and human characteristics about you based on your ethnicity. And that's obviously we've seen how problematic that can be, because it assumes that that people are a monolith in the wrong way, right? People are supposed to be a monolith in the sense that we are all image bearers of the Lord Jesus Christ and of God, adorning us with that image and likeness in creation. We're supposed to be a monolith in that way. However, we've made ourselves monoliths in the sense that you are, your image and likeness is associated with the color or pigmentation of your skin, and there are character traits that come with that. And so, because you are a Caucasian man, you think XYZ, right? You are XYZ. You
Mm.
you make decisions like XYZ. Because I am an African American man, I am XYZ. I think like XYZ, and so on and so forth. And I think we've observed how that's played out in society. It has not gone well. It hasn't worked for us at all. But I think we're almost too far gone to admit it.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems is that at the point that we're at, we're not entirely sure not only what went wrong, but also we're not entirely sure the scope of the problem and how many admissions need to be had in order to get to the fact that, hey, here's the problem, we found it, we know what it is, now we
Right.
can start looking for solutions. It's very difficult to pin down when it started going wrong, because it's not like when the word race was invented, that wasn't the beginning of the problem. Discrimination and the separation of groups started prior to the idea that it was separated based on our physical skin tone appearance or how close to the equator our ancestors happen to live, right?
Sure.
um the idea that we were separated by groups or by nations or by ethnicity is actually older than even the concept of race or the word race. And so I'm not going to pretend like it just emerged out of nowhere with
Right.
no, like with no real backdrop or anything like that. um One of the things that I want to be fair to is the fact that when we look at something, we categorize it, and when we
Hmm.
categorize it, we simplify it, and it's for the sake of relating to it, right?
Yes.
um in order for me to relate to most things in the world, I have to simplify and condense the thing by putting it in some sort of familial category so that I know my relation and relevance to it. If I don't know my relation and relevance to something or someone, then I don't know, there's no way for me to map how it is I should behave in and with that, right? And
Right.
so in some sense it's necessary for when I look at you or when you look at me to say, hey, that's a white guy, hey, that's a black guy, hey, that's a tall guy, hey, that's a short guy.
Sure.
But what I think your sentiment was not to relegate the inside of the person to a category simply because the visual of the person fits a category.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it has its place, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Like it's okay to acknowledge these differences about each other. These differences are there, and they're good. It's good. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think the problem is that we've placed the differences on too high of a position within the hierarchy of how we are supposed to perceive one another.
So I think that's a good point. Let's say it has a place.
Sure.
Well, no, let's ask the question, does race as a category of how you can define or identify yourself, does that have a valid and ordinate place in the hierarchy of identity that we've talked about before in relation to the image of God? Is this a farce category altogether, just bunk, or is it something that has an ordinate place but has become inflamed,
There,
right?
bingo. I think that's the issue. Is I think it has a place, but I think we've inflamed it. It's become inflamed, and I think also not only has it become inflamed, I think it's also become I don't want to say inflamed, inflated. We've or elevated. There we go. Elevated.
Mm.
It's become elevated to where now uh, I don't even see an image bearer of God almost in certain situations. I see an image bearer of, well, okay, here it is. Here it is. I just thought this out loud. Here we go. For some of us, we see an image bearer of God based off the pigmentation of their skin.
Mm. Okay. So by that you mean this person images God more closely because they look like me.
Bingo.
Interesting. Okay. I think that probably accounts for why it has been the case that, let's say, in the last 200-300-ish years, we haven't seen a huge rise of opposition toward racial discrimination, even inside the body, right? Not that the abolitionists and the people who are working to end slavery and the civil rights movement, a lot of those people that were proactive were people who were in fact Bible believing Christians who claim the
Correct.
name of Christ.
Correct.
But so were their opposition. It's a very
Ah.
awkward situation that it wasn't a one-sided venture.
Mm-hmm.
There was actually this very strange internal turmoil where the people were, butting heads because of the fact, and the same thing is happening very persistently right now, even on the another front, which is the situation with abortion laws and things like that. You have people who are Christian who are like, individualism and freedom are ultimate goods, and they should bow the knee to any other moral scruples that I might have. And I can do this because I believe that I should treat everybody equally, and I wouldn't want the government interfering in my personal life. So I should do something proactively to vote in favor of the government staying out of the way if someone else has a decision that they want to make in their own personal life. And we draw lines where they don't actually belong, and we erase lines where they actually do belong.
Correct. And
I
think that could very well be leading into one of the sore spots for a lot of Black Christians here in America, as well as all over the world, who are aware of some of the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And we know that the European slave masters, we know that the Bible was used to manipulate and enslave people, as well as to manipulate those who were enslaved into believing that they were doing God's will by subjecting themselves to this treatment by their slave masters. Now we know that the Bible was manipulated and certain books were removed from slave Bibles and things like that. We're fully aware. Actually, one of the funny things about that is that the very passages where a lot of skeptics have issues with the Bible and slavery, those passages were completely taken out of slave Bibles, which is very interesting to consider. Like the entire book of Leviticus was removed from the slave Bible. But
that's rather conspicuous.
yeah, that's interesting. But that people go there for their issues with slavery in the Bible. But anyway, yeah, we know that these things took place, right? We know there was a bastardization of Christianity and Christian values to achieve an ulterior motive on the part of the slave masters. But one of the things that I find interesting, though, was that the same Bible and scriptures that were manipulated and misused for ulterior motives were also used to be the light that shined in the dark place and revealed the manipulation and the motives of these people who were doing this for their own personal gain.
That's right. And it shows also how powerful it is to have a Bible that is disjointed from its actual internal narrative, and how you can use narrative to spin things, even biblical data, to fit an idea. And people are much more willing to follow a narrative than they are to follow didactic teachings or some sort of explicit, hey, when the Bible says this, it means this. And then you just explain the thing. People are much more willing to follow if you attach your point, not to a teaching, but to a testimony. Right. And so there'll be people who use the scripture wrongly in order to manipulate others to think that what the scripture is trying to indicate is this, when in fact it's actually the opposite. Right. I know that in my experience, when I was in high school and I'm like doing reading and stuff, there's a lot of availability to go to, a library or whatever. I wasn't looking in the library. I was actually just talking to the history teachers because I like to talk.
Sure.
And so I like to talk, and I'm talking to the teachers. And I had a teacher in 10th grade, or no, it was in 9th grade. I had a teacher in 9th grade who was doing history. And one of the things that he had said was that the history book that we were using in class was not inaccurate, but incomplete. And I didn't know what he meant by that. I went up to him afterward and I asked him, and he gave me some examples, and some of the examples that he gave of the history books that we had being not inaccurate but incomplete was to say that the history books had some mention of what had taken place with the annexing of American land and the relegating of natives to reservations, but it didn't say how, it didn't say why,
Sure.
it didn't say what took place internally for those communities. It said America annexed this land, this is what happened at this time, sort of zoom out like we just did a moment ago with defining the thing, and then didn't zoom in to explain anything that actually took place. It just gives you a date and an event and leaves it there, right? Nowadays,
much the same with the transatlantic slave trade, right? It
right.
tells you it tells you what happened, but it doesn't exactly give you all the details, right? It doesn't tell you who all was involved, and kind of just says, hey, Europeans show up in Africa, put slaves in chains, bring them back to America. They don't exactly tell you how or who helped to facilitate, or the fact that it was a trade, right? So there was an exchange of goods and services for these people, and they don't tell you who benefited from these exchange of goods and services for these people, right? So yeah, I that's another example there where it's like it's in there, but it's incomplete.
I had mentioned this. If anybody didn't catch it on was it Tuesday or Wednesday? Tuesday, I think. I had released an episode of Cosmic Corner that I had pre-recorded talking to my friend Alex about Satan's playbook with temptation and sin. One of the things that I had mentioned in that episode was that I love lyricism and poetry. I quoted a short line from a song that I enjoy, where the lyrics were very powerful and very relevant, and it's relevant to what we're talking about now. Is the victor writes the story, but more often burns the manuscript. He sets fire to the pyre and cremates the crimes that he commits. But the fires kept us warm, so we bit our tongues and tasted scorn. And this is the way that people have done things for a long time. And it's not an American thing to have the victor write the story and burn the manuscripts. That is not an American thing. That is a human thing. There is not one conquest that happened throughout the millennia of the world that did not destroy its prior culture, except for the divine conquest of the Christians bringing the gospel around the world. It was, in fact, the birthplace of documented history as we now know and understand it.
Correct.
From Christians who went into different nations, even into pagan nations. And they went through the painstaking documentation and writing down of the past and the belief and the practices of the people that were there. Even their pagan belief systems were written down. And the only reason that we have such extensive writing about, let's say, the Norse belief system is because the Christians that arrived in that place didn't destroy the prior culture. They integrated it by saying, all of your gods have someone to bow to. No longer did they rule you. You are not a plaything of the gods. You're in fact superior to them because you're an image of the living God. Let me introduce you to him. Right? And so in some sense, there's a like almost a remedy awaiting under the surface when you start thinking about the captivating success that we've seen on a global and historical scale with the way that God spreads his nation or his in-group, his people, versus the way that other people as humans, led by either other humans or lesser gods, have spread themselves, is by way of conquest and deletion or consumption rather than integration, right? And so it's interesting that from a Christian mindset, from a Western mindset, from a Christian foundation, where the idea of English common law even emerged from, and the idea that even the king is under the same law as me, and birthed the idea of equality that we now venerate so much. We all love the idea of equality, and it's touted all over the place. That could only have emerged from a society that was based on a worldview that involved an integration rather than a consumption.
Mhm.
Right. And it's not necessarily the case that when Christianity spread, it always spread by integrating. Sometimes it was done wrong. But most of the time, when Christianity successfully spread itself throughout all of the rest of the world, it was doing so by infiltrating from underneath.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It was a person to person integration from one another. And I think that's why now in the modern self, it almost seems self-evident, but we don't know why it is that it seems like diversity is something to be seen as virtuous.
Mhm.
Is because we come from a world that valued integration. Why do we come from a world that values integration? Why is that our inheritance? Because Christianity spread like wildfire. That's why.
Correct. True, and I would say, true Christianity spread like wildfire, right? Not these bastardized renditions of them that seem to serve certain people or certain individuals, whoever introduces them with ulterior motives. When true Christianity spreads, it spreads like wildfire, and it spreads by integration. It's image bearers informing other image bearers that they're image bearers and welcoming them into the family of image bearers.
So I think we agree that starting from above, you can see, okay, here's the landscape, here's the very edges of everything, here's the center of everything. Race lands somewhere in the framework of this.
Yep.
Right? If we say I have a structure, in the structure is my personal identity, right? Or my sense of self, or whatever other jargon you want to associate that with. Your identity as it actually is, rather than your preference for how you are seen. Your identity as it actually is some structure. And you said that you believe race has been elevated beyond its merit. Where exactly should it live within this structure? What is it that it's attached to that makes it something that is ordinately involved in the structure? Not that it should be at the top informing everything else, because it's simply not a big enough container to hold your entire identity. It's insufficient. But where does it live?
Currently?
No, where should it live? Not where does it. Where should it live? We know where it does live right now is in a place of prominence that it doesn't deserve. Where should it end up? In a perfect world with perfect people who understood their identity perfectly, racial identity would land where?
If you were to ask me, it would land somewhere in the secondary and tertiary level of things. Very little of what truly matters within a person's character has to do with the pigmentation of their skin. It's a very concerning thing when we define ourselves by things that we have no control over. It's very problematic. Maybe it's different from you than me, but I had nothing to do with the fact that I was born a black man. Zero, from what I recall. Now, yeah, I don't remember all my life, but what I remember, the part I remember, I had zero to do with that, right? But I treat it as though I picked it, as though I made an informed decision to be the skin pigmentation that I am. And that's very problematic, because I ought to be identified by the things about me that I have control over, such as, do I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength? Do I love my neighbor as myself? Am I honest? Do I have integrity? Am I a hard worker? Am I trustworthy? Am I reliable? Am I a good friend? Am I a good brother? Am I a good son? Do I honor my mother and my father? To identify myself and hold those against that standard is a much more fruitful and productive thing to do. But when I allow myself to be identified by something I have no control over and put that at the apex of my hierarchy of values and allow it to flow down and saturate everything else about me, I think we end up in a really problematic spot.
I think what you just laid out is probably exactly why it doesn't belong at the top. Because if the tone of my skin lives at the top of everything else, all the things you just mentioned are either a byproduct or their absence is a byproduct of my physical appearance, right?
Yes, Josh.
So let's say
yes.
So let's say I look, and maybe this is the case because I grew up in a place where I never really was much of a majority. But I don't look at somebody who is of a darker complexion than myself. Let's say they're Filipino, or they're Hispanic, or they're Indian, and they, like South India or Samoan. South India has very dark skin, right?
Sure.
Certain parts of Brazil has very dark skin.
Sure.
Jamaicans have very dark skin.
Yes.
Central Africa has very dark skin.
Yeah.
There's so much there. It's like this entire band around the planet, and there's no shortage of space around the planet, but it's not a very large space around the planet that has the equator, right? And it seems like because of it's just a feature of our planet, this is how we developed. And so the assertion then would be, if this is something that's of primary importance, that you came either from the equator or from the northern and southern hemisphere, and you're either darker or lighter, if that informs moral categories, then there are some serious implications. Right?
We're in a lot of trouble, and that's where, and this is even infiltrated, the church, and we can get there in a second. We got major problems here when I allow my my perception of your moral aptitude to be informed by that which you have no control over. It's almost to say you don't have control over your morals if this is at the apex of who you are and how you identify yourself. You actually don't have control over your morals in that case.
Right. And I should, right. And in some sense, I could either disdain you or pity you because you don't look like me, or I could be jealous because you don't look like me, or I could be fearful because you don't look like me, or I could be suspect because you don't look like me, or I could be any number of things that my reaction to somebody, let's say my reaction to somebody's physical appearance can be ordinate or inordinate. Yeah.
Yep.
If somebody walks up to me and physically they appear and they behave like a threat to me, then I'm not stupid or inordinate or evil for being cautious, right? Like, let's say if somebody was giving me the big bright eyes, side eyes, the eyebrows, you can read a facial expression. You can see where somebody is at, right? And then you can see from their body language that they're making themselves big, right? Then they're walking up on you. They're walking quickly. They're making a direct line to you. You can read all these cues physically, visually. You're assessing and you're being discriminatory by distinguishing their facial features, their body language from what you would expect. And the violation of your expectation is enough to alarm you. All of these are completely normal. They're completely normal reactions. Right, exactly. And where people go very, very strange with this very quickly is, let's say you have a little old lady who's not at all a threat to anybody, and she's not doing anything. She's walking down the street. She has very little expectation for what's going on, but she lives in a rather homogenous society of people who look and sound roughly exactly like she does. And she's walking down the street, and then lo and behold, she looks in front of her, and across the street, walking toward her, is somebody who looks more like you. Right. And as she's walking down the street and she looks up and she notices Jaylen walking toward her, she doesn't have any any backlog of expectation for how to look at someone who is distinguishable from her in that way and how
Sure.
she should behave and react to her. So her first impulse to see something different is to be aware that there is something different. That something different might raise alerts in her and make her react or respond in a certain type of way. Is she then assessing you as a threat because of a moral category or because of an ignorance to what category you might fit in? Is that racism, or is that simply an ordinate response to something that is different? Because I think this is what a lot of people do nowadays is we try to play these very strange category games
Mhm.
where we see somebody reacting in a certain way and we call it something like an implicit bias, right? Or we
Sure.
call it a a subconscious kind of systematic, impregnation that you're just like racist on the house, right?
Yeah.
And that just kind of follows you around, and then it manifests at certain times. And it's like, okay, if you see somebody who looks different than you and you respond to them at all, it's by definition racist. Whereas in some sense, let's say that lady is walking down the street, she sees somebody who looks like you and says, that guy's untrustworthy because I had an experience one time that violated me. And I'm going to throw you in the same bag as that experience back then and mark you the same threat as what I got from that experience back then. That is a very, very distinctly different reaction.
Correct. But the easy thing to do now, especially in our culture, is to say immediately, the reason you're doing this is because I'm black or because I'm white or whatever, right? It's the easy button to hit, right? It's the easy button, doesn't require much thought. It doesn't require the nuance that you just laid out, right? It doesn't require me to sit back and detach myself from the way I may feel in a certain moment and think through the context of the situation, and that's too much work, right? It's easy to just say racism and be done with it. It's the easy button. It's there. You can see it, right? It's visually satisfying, right? And that can be the end of the conversation. Doesn't make it true whatsoever. Not even remotely close. But it was easy, and because my feelings are involved, and that may be the way I feel in the moment. I'm going with it, and I'm going to be validated by those around me who share some of the same ideas.
Well, let's say for just a moment that because of the fact that she noticed somebody's skin color, that was the first thing she recognized. And because of its difference, she reacted, right?
Right.
Is that the same thing? Let's say it's the old woman now, instead of being a white lady from the South who's had no exposure, from the North who's had no exposure to anybody who looks different from her. Let's say it's somebody who's more from my neck of the woods who has experience with people who are different from her, but not enough social experience that she doesn't know how to build an expectation, but she's had the visual at least, right? A quaint, nice, very respectable old black lady who's walking down the street, and she sees somebody who's like me. I'm 6 foot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a small dude. I'm a big guy, and I take up a lot of space, and I tend to walk quickly, right? And I look different. And a lot of the time, I've had, like, even Tyler, one of our co-hosts on Faith Unaltered, I met him in person. The first thing he said to me was, "Holy crap, dude! I'm glad I didn't meet you in a bar fight." Right? He was like, you're a terrifying human being. Look at the size of your hands. I'm like, dude, you're taller than I am. He's like, I don't care. You could make me a pretzel. Right? I'm like, well, I wouldn't. Right? It's like, well, I wouldn't. And he's like, looking at you, I don't know that.
Sure.
Now, is that a judgment that he's making because I belong in a class of villains, or because I match a visual for an expectation?
Yeah. And I love, see, once again, the amount of effort and thought that you're taking to walk through this is so much more than just hitting the easy button and just saying racism. You clutched your purse because I'm a black man, not because I mean, you're a big guy. I'm a 6'3", 220-pound guy myself. So I can be intimidating if I'm walking down the street, especially, with an older lady, like you said, and she sees me walking up. This could be problematic, right? And but if she clutches her purse walking by me, oh, lady, you did that because I'm black. not because I'm 6'3", 220 pounds, pretty strong dude. Probably can snatch that purse right off your shoulder and dislocate your shoulder when I do it. No problem. But it's easy to just hit the racist button and be affirmed in those feelings, right? Especially in today's culture.
And what's implicitly laying under the surface of that assumption too is all of the baggage that we just said shouldn't be packed into race. When somebody says, you reacted to me because of my race, you're a racist, what they're doing implicitly is admitting, I also believe race makes a difference to my person, and you evidence it to me that I'm right about that. That when I say it's because I'm black, that all of my honesty, my trustworthiness, my character, my virtue, my merit as an acceptable member of society, and my self-gratifying expectation of how you should react to me is all packed into my skin tone. And if you react negatively to my presence, it's because of my skin tone, and because of my skin tone, all of my character is dropped in with it, right? Instead of saying, you have no exposure to my character whatsoever, and I might be scary looking. I should probably have some self-awareness on that level, right? Not that that's always the case, and I'm not trying to pretend like everybody who has ever had anybody react to them on the street is like, oh, that there aren't any racists. I know that there are real racists in the world. They're there. They're real. Right? I'm not pretending that away. What I'm saying is that the implicit assumption that happens when somebody resorts to this immediately without doing any of the backdrop that we just discussed, all of these things kind of expose the fact that reality is actually rather a dangerous place. And if you don't know that, it's because you're naive or stupid. Right? Like, absolutely. Reality is a very strange place. The other thing that we have to recognize is that some people have built expectations based on appearance for things. There are some times when building an expectation on the appearance of things makes sense. And there are other times when building an expectation on the appearance of things doesn't make sense. And there are other times when you don't have enough exposure to something to build an expectation. In those situations, is it normal? Is it merited? Is it moral to have a kind of self-preservation or reaction toward situations that you don't know how to react to, right?
And Josh, the reality is we all do it. We all do it.
Yeah.
And you have to. It's almost like you don't even think about it. But in situations where you are unaware of your surroundings and those who surround you, the values and the cultural norms or whatever of those around you, you automatically go into self-preservation mode. Everybody does it. The white guy going into the west side of Compton does it. And so did the black guy going into Beverly Hills. Everybody does.
Exactly. Well, what's interesting too is that in my experience, let's say in high school, I went to a high school that was very, very racially diverse. Okay. Right. In most of my classes that I attended in high school, I was maybe one of 2 to 5 white kids in the class.
Okay.
Right. It was very rare for me. It was very rare for me to have a class where the person sitting next to me, in front of me, behind me, looked like me. Right.
Okay.
I didn't build an expectation because of that experience. I didn't build an expectation that the person who would be next to me, in front of me, or behind me would look like me. So when people don't look like me, my expectation is simply not violated.
Sure.
Does that mean that I have a moral, like I'm morally better than somebody who grew up in a homogenous society where everybody roughly looked the same? Do I have a moral advantage? Let's say maybe I'm not morally better. Is there a moral advantage to growing up in a place where you don't have to build an expectation for everybody to look like you? Because it seems like right now, the way that everybody's talking about it, there's 2 very strange things dancing around in our heads. One is that diversity is good. The other is I need to be represented and I need to find people that look like me. How do you have those two things dancing around in your head at the same time and say both of these are absolutely necessary? I go to a church where, let's say I'm in a neighborhood. I end up at a black church. There's one right around the corner from my house. I was walking by in the neighborhood that I'm at. I'm walking by. I look inside the window, and there's a man, and there's a woman, and there's an older lady, and then there's a guy that looks kind of younger. They're all sitting around a table. They have Bibles, and I was like, "Whoa, they're doing a Bible study." I looked through the window. Right? Nobody noticed me looking through the window. I walked up and I knocked on the door of this like random room that was like, this is part of a church. It looks like it, or this is an apartment. I hope it's nobody's house. I hope I'm not being a creep right now looking in their window. Right. But I saw these people, they were doing a Bible study. It was obvious. They had little books open. They had Bibles next to it. One of them had a pen in his mouth. Like they were doing a Bible study. Knocked on the door, and the guy that answered the door was the older gentleman that was sitting at the table. He happened to be the pastor of the church. And I was just like, hey, let me get in on this. You guys are doing a Bible study, and I'm just walking around aimlessly because my wife and my kids aren't home. I don't particularly need to be home right now. I don't have anything else to do. Can I join you? They were like, heck yes. And they immediately let me come in. Yeah. Shout out to Pastor Ralph. Exactly. Pastor Ralph is wonderful. I went into his church. He immediately accepted me as not a white guy who walked and knocked on the door. He immediately accepted me as somebody who he saw as being passionate about being near people of the Lord. And he immediately brought me in. And he was like, here's a Bible study book. Do you have a Bible on you? And I was like, no. He's like, here's a Bible. Come sit with us.
Now and that's an example of an image bearer who saw another image bearer for what they are intrinsically, and said, come on in. We can figure the rest out later.
Right. And what's cool, what was even cooler about that is that a long-term relationship started to take place where I went to their Bible studies every Thursday. Every single Thursday I'd walk down there and I would do Bible studies until my job ended up being in a way that I couldn't like make them anymore, or I had to watch the kids because of my wife and just things get in the way from consistency and regularity. But I was with and among them for every single week for like a year and a half, and all of a sudden his wife came up to me and was just like, you know what, Josh, I really appreciate that you can speak the language for our young people. We want you to come and talk at a youth conference we're going to hold for all of our sister churches in this area, like 3 churches that we're going to bring the youth groups together. And we'd like you to come to speak to the young people. And I'm like, whoa, for real? And then the pastor was like, yeah, absolutely. Also, by the way, we're going to do a men's conference soon. Would you mind talking at that one too? And I'm like, whoa, are you serious? And he's like, yeah. And so, of course, I'm like, yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. Like, that's so cool. Let me try to prepare myself if I can. And then, when I get there, it's like, still, I'm the only white guy in the room. There's a bunch of like teenagers who are just like, from all these different local black churches from around and they look at me, and all of them look at me and they're like, sure. You see this guy? Like, what is he? You know what I mean? And so they're just like,
what is he about to do?
Right, exactly. And they had no idea what expectation to have, because they've seen white people around, whatever. They probably interacted with them at school or whatever, right? But in this setting, in their setting, in the world they inhabit presently, they're going to a place where their expectation is everybody in this place is roughly going to look and sound and act just like me. And then they walk in and they go, what is going on with this weird pale guy? You know what I mean? Like, what is he doing? Why is he he's on the stage? What is he doing? Right. It's like, I remember the second time that I got to speak at one of their youth conferences. They did it in the big church, right? And had everybody set up. The stage at the front, obviously. And when I walked in, what I did was I walked in from the back through middle aisle, like almost like a bride does at a wedding. Walked through the middle aisle, got up on the stage, and I began to preach. The reason I did it that way is because I wanted everybody to notice what I was doing, right? I was trying to draw attention to something, right? And by then, they had already built an expectation, because this wasn't the first time they had seen me. This guy still belongs, right? But at first, the first time, when I walked in the room the exact same way, I didn't get the exact same treatment. I didn't get the exact same reaction, right? And something in me, if I'm honest, the first time that happened rose up in me and made me feel very self-conscious for being that seen. And not just seen because I can be in front of a crowd and speak publicly. That's not a problem. Being seen in that sense, which is to notice being red on the face of everybody in front of you. I'm the thing violating the expectations right now.
Sure,
I'm an offense.
I'm breaking the norm. I'm the sore thumb, if you
right.
will. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like I'm walking in and I'm automatically an offense. Is it because of something I did? No. All I did was show up. Right. And so it's not like, and this is the only reason I say this is because I wanted to point out it's not like somebody who looks like me has no understanding what it's like to walk into a place and be the thing that violates everyone else's expectation.
Yep.
The place of being the person in the room whose expectation is violated in that way is very much little more than a, let's say, social majority privilege.
Sure.
Right? Because if I went to China,
I do that on my job quite often these days. I'm the one that violates the order and the structure with the position I hold in my company. I'm actually the first Black person to hold my position in my company's history. Been around for 50 years. I've been there for about 8 of them. And so I do that a lot. I'm the violation of the order. Which I enjoy. I like violating things, for godly purposes, of course. But I'm the one that does that these days.
My sister knows that I am a very proficient go against the grain.
That's why I put my title as the rogue one today. I'm like, that's what I do. Cool. I go rogue.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, I think that there's one of the things that makes it such a difficult thing to talk about now is the prevalence of the idea that, and I'm glad that this is one of the first things that you said was just because you're not somebody of a darker complexion means you're not allowed to have an opinion because you don't share my experience as a ... person.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
As though the experience that I've had as a ... person was the experience I was supposed to have in the first place. And the way that I perceived my experience is the way that I was supposed to perceive my experience in the first place. And there's a lot that goes into that, right? Because, right now we're in a culture now that we glorify victimhood, right? And we champion the oppressed. In a weird way, we almost make the oppressed the oppressor in some ways with how we champion and glorify and worship it, right? Because we do that, we end up jading the viewpoints of those who don't share in our experience, and when they come with a different perspective than what we're accustomed to, or using certain buzzwords the way that we want to hear them, and being able to say, hey, I experienced this too. If you're unable to say that, your voice ought to be silenced. It's like, no, that's not necessarily true. That's not how it works. It's not that if you haven't had this experience, be quiet. No, not necessarily. That's not a wise way to do things, nor is it godly whatsoever. But that's where we are, right?
It's a very ironic place to be too, because it's not like, let's say we'll reverse this. I'm a white guy. Have you ever been a white guy, Jaylen?
I've not.
You should probably not talk about being a white guy. Shame on you. Sure. Right? Like, it's just such a weird thing to say out loud. Like, okay, if I'm white, I'm not allowed to talk about race because I've never had the experience of being a Black person. Right? In the same token, then a Black person shouldn't have any credence to be able to talk about what a white person thinks or does.
Sure. And you'd also know what it assumes. It assumes that because I'm Black, I've experienced racism. That's not true.
Fair enough.
And it also assumes because you're white that you haven't experienced racism. It's not true.
Right.
Who said that? But but it's so many monoliths being being ascribed and applied to these conversations. It is to assume because I am black, I've experienced racism, and there are loads of black people who have never experienced racism, especially the younger that we get. And the further we become removed from the Jim Crow South and all of these different things that took place, there are loads of black people who've never experienced racism whatsoever. However, but because I fit the mold of the color, I fit the requirement. I'm the color. Oh, he must know what it's like. Not true. Not true.
Or it and not necessarily he must know what it's like, but if in the absence of overtly racist experiences, the gap is being filled with the automatic assumption that every experience and interaction you have has the undertone of racism by default, right? Like
Sure.
you don't have to have somebody be overtly like racist against or toward the person in order for them to be like, no, well, there's still the implicit racism or biases, and then you can just ghost hunt to oblivion, right? And kind of almost surface things by like you have to impute motive onto the other person and their subconscious and their thoughtless actions or their facial expressions or their, let's say, impulsive reactions toward things, and you immediately like you it's the same way that when people who are in different theological camps
Sure.
assume a motive onto the other person so that they don't have to deal with the argumentation,
Sure.
right? It's I if I can just stuff you into this box, then I don't have to deal with it, right? I
Right.
can just I can treat it as though it's the same as this other thing, right? It's not though. It's not the same as the other thing. And
Mm-hmm.
to do so, technically speaking, is also a very strange racism, right?
Sure.
If
It
I were
is.
to like, let's say if I did grow up at the experience of being a black guy and I saw a white guy, and my first assumption about him is he's white, therefore he's judging me for being not white.
Sure.
If that's the thought process that's being instilled in someone, there's very little to guard against them just extrapolating that outward everywhere, right? The same
Mm-hmm.
way as if somebody, let's say when I was growing up, I had direct exposure to somebody who had spent a good deal of time in prison, and while they were there and even beforehand, they had developed a genuine belief system that white supremacy was a real thing that made sense and was true, and especially true about them, that they personally were superior over other people because of their skin and because of what group they live or they operated in, what group that they could be tossed in. This is something that's especially prevalent in jail, right? Especially if I were to go to jail, I would be expected to be I'd be a white guy, right?
Sure.
That's not even a selective thing anymore. That's just the world you're thrusted into,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's like that kind of assumption that's laying in the underbelly of things is also, it's another piece of it you can't necessarily ignore away, right? Because it's the people that are going into the prisons, the people that are coming out of the prisons are all existing when they're in the prison, can be a very diverse place, and yet there's no virtue to the diversity there because they insist on separation, and the
Sure.
separation that they create is artificial, right? But it's not artificial when it's being enforced. Those separations become real when they're enforced, right?
Right.
And so like this is what's happening when we this is why as parents we need to be especially careful with how we deal with our children with questions of this kind, right? Where like I'm very grateful that my kids grow up in a place like I did, that they don't merely build an expectation that everybody looks and sounds and acts like them. What's really interesting is that because I've never actually explicitly had a conversation with my kids about the appearance of others and race and culture and whatever, I've never needed an explicit conversation with my kids about those things because they see me personally day to day interacting with people that do and do not look, sound, act like me.
And the vast majority of children, particularly when you're talking that toddler age, you don't have to have that conversation with them. The vast majority of them, if you put kids of different races in a room or different ethnicities in a room, chances are they'll just start playing together.
Yeah.
And no one will. The boys will play with the girls will play with the boys. There will be very little questions asked about skin pigmentation and who you are and your cultural values. They don't go there. They don't, they almost have this blissful blindness to it in a good way.
Yeah.
And yeah, you just don't have to have that conversation with them. It's not until the corrupted, rotten perspectives of the adults around them get a hold of them and taint them and soil them that these things come into practice.
And what's cool is there's actually when I was a kid, one of my favorite movies, my sister can back me up on this. One of my favorite movies I watch on repeat, Land Before Time. I love that movie. Even now, I love that movie. I love that movie. It's absolutely shattering, but it's beautiful. The opening of that movie is very compelling because Littlefoot is absolutely baffled by the fact that he's a long neck and there's a three horn, and they're just not allowed to be around each other because, well, that's just how we do things, kid.
Yep.
Man, that impacted me a lot as a kid because I wasn't taught that we don't go around other people because they don't look like us. I didn't have a hook to hang that hat on. There are other people who don't share my experience of growing up in a place where that things are just kind of diverse on the house, right? Like there are people that grew up in a place where everybody that they grew up around was a long neck, and then they go and they meet somebody who's a three horn for the first time. They're like, whoa. And either they're taught prior to that experience to be suspect of that person, or because they haven't been taught to be suspect of that person, they might naturally have an inclination to be curious, but also cautious. And those two things might appear the same from the outside, is all I'm saying, right? When you're on the receiving end of somebody noticing and reacting to you, not every teenager in the room when I walked up to that youth conference to go speak was looking at me and being like, why did they invite a white guy? What is going on here? Some of them were like, whoa, that's weird. But nothing negative was coming to mind. But on their face, they might have been like, whoa, that's weird. But the same weird that you would give if somebody brought out like a, like a porcupine from their backpack or something. You'd be like, what? Right? It's just like, nobody expected this. What a weird thing. Wow. But then the look on their face might be received as they view me negatively because I violate their expectation.
Sure.
Right. And so there's so many things happening in those types of interactions because it's all implicit. It's all unspoken. Body language, facial features, things like that. That's different than, let's say, racial slurs or hate crimes or things like that. Which
there's an intentionality to those things, right? Those are an outflow of the character, right? Not an outflow of what's beyond my control.
Right, exactly. And so my sister asked a really interesting question, and it's not necessarily like what we were just talking about. It's kind of a tangent, but I think that it's relevant, and it's something that we should probably kind of explore a little bit, which is what about the perception of white savior complex? Are you familiar with that terminology?
I've heard it, but I'm curious. What
So from what I understand about it, it's something like, let's say there are people who are white people who recognize the unfairness, the injustice, and the plight of people who don't look like me, who have had a really, really crap time of it, and my heart feels for them, as it should, right? But then it goes a step further, and I think because I have feelings of empathy and pity towards somebody who has gone wrong or had a bad experience, that I therefore should look at them as somebody who is helpless, as somebody who requires my help, and that my help makes me think, again, implicitly, prior to action, that I'm in a position of superiority to be able to help this person who is down low. And it almost, in the same sense as somebody who believes in racial supremacy, puts themselves above a person who's not white. The person who's white, who has empathy and pity for somebody who's been treated wrongly, then thinks of themselves as the helper that's supposed to swoop in and save this other person because, well, I have this position of prominence because of my skin, right? It's like the white knight savior kind of thing, right? Where somebody who is, and again, in the political sphere, it's a lot of these things are related to political ideology, but in general, it's something that kind of, like how would I use my white privilege to better those people who don't have white privilege, is to assume by definition that my whiteness puts me in a position of superiority over other people. And I think that my whiteness makes me a savior, and it gives me a complex where I feel like now I need to go out and I need to be the advocate. I need to be the voice for the Black people. Right. And that sort of thing. And it's a very strange phenomena, but it's something that I do see kind of happening, but it's mostly subconscious, where somebody, like you'll let's say you'll have somebody who's a Black lady talking about her experience, and then some white lady who hears it goes, yeah, and da 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 da, and starts filling in gaps, speaking over the person that was actually just speaking about their experiences. Now you're trying to fill the gaps and speak even more. I'm advocating for this person, but really you're interrupting and taking up space.
Right.
That sort of
you're actually silencing the victim.
Right, but not on purpose. Not on purpose.
You mean well, but you're silencing the victim.
Right, exactly. And so that white savior complex is the mean well, but doing it horribly.
Okay, got it. So on a micro level, I can understand certain situations where a person may feel this way and be compelled to do something about it. In isolated situations in the here and now, I can understand that. I think this as a blanket cultural or societal norm is a terrible idea. The reason I think that, the reason I feel that way is because I am convinced that the issues that systematic racism or systemic racism that they caused for African Americans in this country long ago, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s up to a point. I'm convinced that those issues are no longer the problem. I don't think the issues that plague Black people in this country require a white savior. I don't think so.
So then, okay, so let's flip that over a little bit. Let's say, is there a place for the people who are white, who recognize that things have gone wrong and the past is a disgusting and ugly place?
Yes.
Insofar as we can look back and be like, wow, we're on a convenient side of history. How about that? That went wrong. Look at how many ways that went wrong, right? Is it then the duty of somebody who's of that appearance, of that category, whatever, is it then a kind of moral obligation for that person to then use their voice, as they have a voice? It's assumed that they have a special kind of voice because of that, right? Should they then go out of their way to use that voice to advocate for other people, right? And I think that
it depends on what they're advocating for. What are they using their voice to advocate for? And in the here and now and today in 2025 here in America, a lot of the rhetoric and narratives that I hear with regards to people advocating for minority communities, I oftentimes find that what they're advocating for is not helpful. And it does not solve, it's a Band-Aid. A lot of it's Band-Aid, but it does not solve the problem.
She added a little bit here. She said it can also be thrown around as an insult to a white person who means well to speak up for injustice, then the person who is being protected doesn't need white folks to do that. And so it's a perceived offense. Again, almost in the same way that the person is lamenting that people have viewed them wrongly for their race, right?
Sure.
And the person who's white, who recognizes that that's happened, begins to speak up and acknowledge that that happened. And the person who then is being advocated for recognizes that and says, I don't need you to do that. And it's used as a way to shame or silence that person,
Sure.
even though what they're doing is actually what I just laid out, which is sort of like recognizing that that if I have a voice, it could be
Yeah.
aimed productively,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
then there's also that perceived offense, and then the lashing out, something like that.
Yeah. Which, which I think is very unfair for somebody who's simply trying to help, even if they may be doing so in an unproductive way. I think there needs to be a little grace there for that. But it's kind of difficult to have things like grace and patience when the societies progressively become more and more godless. What I've in my experience with in 2025, and I don't want to establish any credentials here, but I come from a low income environment. I grew up on Section 8, single parent household. My parents were 18 and 19 when I was born, in no position to raise a child whatsoever. I grew up on, like I said, Section 8 housing. I lived in this house 15 years old. Came to live with my father. Single parent household, whole thing. But I don't think that this white savior complex is what is going to produce the true remedy that needs to be remedied to see real progress within, let's call it the Black community for the sake of conversation. I don't think the white savior complex is helpful because I don't think it's the problem.
Fair enough. I think that's probably the right way to look at it. Is people's let's say their good intentions don't always land in the best way, but the expectation that because I'm white and I have that unfettered position of privilege, or however you want to parse that out, that I should then use it as a voice of advocacy is not going to be an antidote to the fact that I already just, because of that, assumed that my whiteness gave me a position of prevalence
Mhm.
and power to be able to be a voice for somebody else who's literally in front of me, has a voice of their own. And technically, my invitation to that person to share with me rather than me to share over them and speak on their behalf.
Mhm.
If they didn't ask me to be an ambassador for them, my assertion of myself as an ambassador probably is either going to land poorly or not actually accomplish what my good intentions might
Yeah.
have brought forward to me, for me to try to be that ambassador. I think that probably makes sense, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right there. And like I said, I don't think an ambassador position needs to be filled. I don't think that's what the problem is. I think that if you, I think that there needs to be a reorienting of values and acceptable behaviors that will make for phenomenal progress within the Black community. But like I said, I keep using that term just for the sake of conversation. I don't like the term Black community, but for the sake of this conversation, just because it's easy to understand. I think that more than a white savior or ambassador or any voices that need to be displayed, there needs to be a reorienting within the individuals of the community of priorities and values, mainly aimed toward Christ. And I think upon doing that and allowing that to saturate every other value and every other component of our identities will make for a productive foundation to build upon.
So let's zoom back in a little bit, right? So I think that we've done a good job exploring why the idea of race as a category makes sense but has gone wrong. Let's
Yes.
say, assuming, because I think this is the conclusion we've come to, is that race has a place in informing something about the way that we interact with one another, something about my expectation, something about the level of exposure that I've had to somebody who is either alike or different from myself, right? In terms of let's say like an in-group familial sort of preference, right?
Mhm.
My family is distinct from the rest of the families in the world, not because the other families aren't the same type of family where they have a mother and a father and children, so forth. They're simply not my family, right? So I have
Mhm.
a familial preference. I have a preference for my wife, my children are distinct from all other families because they are mine, right? In the same sense, you could say culture or ethnicity, the way that you were putting it before. My culture, my ethnicity is distinct from all others simply because it is mine, right?
Sure.
It is the one from which I emerged. This
Mhm.
beautiful red beard I've acquired here came from my ethnicity and my genetics. That
And I
came
and I
from
and I can't grow a red beard if I wanted to.
you know what's cool? I have seen black guys that have red hair. It's one of the weirdest but coolest things I've ever seen. It's a
Yeah.
trip. It's a
Yeah.
trip, dude. But it looks really rad.
Yeah.
It looks really rad.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, it's like this right here is a feature of my genetics. It technically, even the way that I have it styled in the shape of my face, is a feature of my culture or my ethnicity, right? I'm Irish and Scottish. I am firmly Northern European, right?
Sure.
You can tell because the light looks the same hitting me as it does leaving. It's just that, like it's just bright. Be
Right.
careful, you should wear sunglasses
Yeah.
during the day, right? That is normal for me because that's where I came from. I have a familiar relationship with this because that's where I came from. I
Yep.
can even attach to that a familial preference. When I was having birthdays during my teenage years, I had a preference for what I would do at those birthdays. And what I did was go to what's called the Celtic Games, which was a giant festival that happened that was relevant to Irishness and Scottishness and the different clans and tartans and the colors with the plaid and the I have a kilt. Like I love that. I
Yeah.
love being Irish. I love being Scottish.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with loving your culture, your
Mhm.
ethnicity, the
Mhm.
idiosyncrasies, the
Mhm.
unities, the
I
history,
love
everything else that's
I
behind it.
love a good cookout.
Right?
I love it.
Right?
Great
Dude,
barbecue, great food. I love it. Good music.
right.
Love a good cookout.
Exactly. One of the things, though, that I want to acknowledge that I think is a part of the conversation, but doesn't get the due that it deserves, is
Yeah.
that some people don't have a trace or a path to follow to go back to a culture or a ethnicity or that, right, like I said, the tartans, the plaid, the kilts, the weapons, the leather, the leather work, the different games and stuff. I know what Irishness and Scottishness is.
Right.
There are people who are, let's say, black or Hispanic or native who don't have any tie back to where that comes from. That is a void in their lives.
Sure.
And that was robbed of them. We had mentioned earlier that some people were brought over to America as property, as economic goods.
Yes.
They don't have that tie back to the my culture,
Yeah.
my place, my people. They're lacking that. They
Yeah.
don't, that's been robbed of them. And because its absence is more profound than its presence, they're trying to fill it with something. There's going to be a my culture. Those cultures who have been robbed of their cultures oftentimes are the ones who are going to be kind of relegated to a margin. We see that happening, right? We've seen that happen over time. And something that emerged from that being marginalized and having no backdrop of the my culture, that there's nothing robust behind it. Something fills the gaps. And what it is not as formidable and solid as that my culture facet would have actually been if it was there to fill the hole, right? Just to acknowledge the fact, because I don't think that it's acknowledged as readily or realistically as it could be.
Sure.
That some people don't have what I have, not because they don't have a culture, but because they don't have any connection to it.
Sure.
And that's so what is it that they're filling that gap with is not all of the facets of that culture that made it beautiful in its expression. Instead, it's merely the surface tension of my skin tone and how I look, the way I talk, and familial in-group on a very localized sense.
Or they're filling it with the narrative of how my culture was stolen from me in the first place.
Right. Being robbed is now that culture. You're exactly right. Yes. Being robbed of culture is now my culture.
Yep.
Right. I think that's probably a mistake. I don't necessarily blame the person for feeling that way if that's the experience that they have. I don't necessarily blame them for identifying with that, because that's actually part of reality. It did happen. It is real, right? But what is it that we can offer? And again, this is kind of to bring it onto more of like an apologetic playing field. How is it that we go about remedying the conversation for this person, acknowledging the fact, just acknowledging the fact, yes, culture was robbed. That was wrong. In its absence, some other thing has to be erected in its place. What is it that we should be offering them to fill that gap? Right? In some obvious platitude sort of way, we can say, give them the gospel. Right?
Sure.
But how do we make that relevant to that whole? How do we use our Jesus, who is the Jesus of every man, to fill that hole that their culture has been robbed? How do we use Jesus to fill that gap?
Well, I think one is by displaying compassion that Jesus would have displayed for the individual, for those of us who have been robbed of our culture and things of that nature, recognizing that what happened, acknowledging it. You don't have to apologize for it because you weren't the one that took it, right? But it's just acknowledging what took place and leaving space for that. Like, no, this happened. And let's pause. It happened, and let's sit with that, right? And then after we've acknowledged it and we've sat with it, we say, okay, now let's acknowledge what we filled the space with. We filled the space with a narrative of victimization, of oppression, and so on and so forth, and even hatred toward those toward those who look like those who stole the culture from us, right? And acknowledge that. Leave space for that, and then say, okay, we need to do away with what we filled the space with, and we need to replace it with something else. We need a new narrative, right? Because the narrative that we have doesn't work for us. This narrative being replicated across time is self-destructive. And so we need to fill this space with a new narrative. Well, what's the new narrative we can fill it with? Well, the new narrative we can fill it with is that even the ones who look like the people that took the culture from us are image bearers of the living God, just like we are, made in his image and likeness to do the same things that we're called to do, which is love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. Those people that look like the ones that stole the culture, those are the neighbors.
Ooh, ouch. Oh man. Yeah.
And so now, what do we do with this Jesus who we claim to love and worship, and we go to church every Sunday and sing about and praise and everything in that sort? What do we do with this guy who gives a parable of the Good Samaritan? When we study that and think that through, and understand all the racial context around that conversation that took place, right? What do we do with this guy who, if he were with us, would tell us to go and be good in our, let's bring it to our narrative, right? Let's bring it to our societal context. If Jesus were giving the Good Samaritan conversation to a group of Black people, it would sound like the Good Caucasian, right? Yeah. And,
yeah. Oh,
and,
man.
And we go and Jesus at the end tells us to go and behave like the Good Caucasian. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with this guy? And if he was given the same parable to a group of white people, he may call it the good black person, the good African American. And at the end of this parable, he tells this group of Caucasians, this group of white supremacists, hey, go behave like the African American that you persecute.
Man. Oh, that's going to piss someone off.
Oh, good.
That's fantastic.
I told you I'm rogue. I told you.
Wow.
So we have to challenge ourselves to acknowledge what happened, but not be identified by what happened, and replace the victim narrative that we have identified ourselves by. Don't get rid of it in terms of its history. Don't forget it, but remove it from the place of identity, the position within yourself that you identify. You use this to identify yourself, and replace that with what Christ says about you and what Christ thinks about you. And when I do that, I'll find myself having to engage the very people that I've discriminated against or that discriminate against me.
So then when we invite when we invite someone, like, so the church around the corner from my house that I'd said I went to their Bible studies, that they immediately welcomed me in.
Sure.
Right? They didn't know anything about me. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't go, hey, you look Irish. Like, is it going to be okay if you, they didn't ask any of those questions. Right. Mm-hmm. But they also didn't look at me and expect that I needed to be distinct from them or needed to be treated as distinct from them in order for the situation to make sense.
Yes. Right?
That's not necessarily the case in every situation, that you're going to have to treat the person as though, oh, there isn't anything, there's no such thing as race. Like, it just doesn't, like,
yeah, well, that's not helpful either. That's not helpful. It's not helpful either. No, it is. He's different looking. He looks different. He's not what we're used to, and we're not what he's used to, right? And that's okay. There's beauty in acknowledging our differences on a surface level, like skin color, but yet it's still seeing one another for who we truly are as image bearers.
So then okay, so if we zoom back out again, let's say, we can say, okay, you being Black or me being white has no bearing on our moral persons. However, where we come from, our family, our environment, and the philosophy that we've been taught implicitly or explicitly when we were growing up is going to inform some of those moral categories. And so, to be fair, again, trying to be as thoughtful and thought-provoking as possible here, to be fair, it's not as though your family, your neighborhood, and perhaps even your appearance had no impact at all on the decisions that you make, or the things that, or let's say the raw materials you had available to you in order to make your choices from. Mm-hmm. Sometimes those things are intrinsically linked, right? So it's not as though, and again, this might muddy the water a little bit, but I don't really care because it's just the honest thing. Sometimes thinking about the fact that I'm Irish and I'm Scottish and I know that about myself gives me a sense of pride or confidence about knowing about myself that informed me and my decisions and my interests and my pursuits. However, me, the individual, has the will and the motive and the moral worth and the ability to pursue. I made the decisions to pursue this or that, to value this or that, to behave in this way or that way. Right.
Mhm.
So it's not the case that just because I'm white, the raw material I have to work with made it like obvious or certain that I would be a certain kind of way. And in the same sense, somebody who's coming from a minority background and comes from an impoverished neighborhood, the white guy that lives in a trailer park is just as impoverished as the black guy that lives in Section 8,
Yes.
right? They're simply not having the same culture, right? There are overlaps for sure, but there are also distinguishing features, right? And so it's like recognizing that a culture is going to inform some of those moral categories and those things about you that are true when we say, oh, Jaylen is this kind of person, right? The first thing that drops into that bucket doesn't have to be Jaylen is a black person. I can say Jaylen is a very moral person. Jaylen is a very accepting person. Jaylen is a very thoughtful person. Jaylen is this or that. Jaylen is an educated.
When we get into the church, particularly amongst Black and white Christians, shame on us if we're not, if the first thing that's not coming out of our mouth is Josh is a Christian and Jaylen is a Christian, and
Yeah,
then
fair enough.
and then we get into, oh, he's a white guy, 6 foot tall, or whatever you want to call it. But we've even allowed some of this rhetoric and some of these these divisive thoughts and these divisive frameworks seep into the church, to where if we will call it a white church or a black church. What the heck is that? Like, that there's a such thing as the black church. What is that for Christians? Now for those who, for those who play church and it's, nothing more than a social club, have at it, enjoy yourself, have a good time. But for those who are Bible believing, Bible practicing, Bible Christ professing Christians, what is a black church? What does that even mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is coming back to the place of prominence that we elect to give to to each facet of identity, right? Acknowledging that there is a place for culture and there is a place for family, there is a place for similarity, there is a place for differences and things like that. I think what Christ does is give us a container or an umbrella large enough to fit all the pieces.
Yes.
Even if we ignorantly or stupidly put them in the wrong arrangement.
Sure.
Christ is so big enough to fit all the pieces. I think that's one of the greatest portions that, like, if we were to, again, come back to an apologetic kind of field to an application, Christ is big enough to contain the black church and the white church enough that they don't have to be a black church and a white church. The reason they don't have to be a black church and a white church is not because we don't have differences, but because Jesus is bigger than them. Because Jesus is the container big enough to integrate both portions of his expression in this church or that church, right? And this is what I meant earlier by race is not a big enough containment for every part of your identity.
No.
But Jesus is.
For sure.
Jesus is a big enough container.
Which is what I was getting at when I said earlier that there needs to be a reorienting of priorities and values as opposed to a savior complex. Now we do need a savior, but just not a, just not in the context of the conversation we were having.
Right.
But yes, absolutely. That's what I was getting at though. With that said, there needs to be a reorienting of priorities and values.
Right. And so I think, okay, so if we were gonna kind of like recorral ourselves back into something that's like a really much neater package. We're about, an hour and 45 minutes. I don't want to take your entire night. Because I know that we started late, so I'm trying to. I didn't want to be ungracious to the conversation, but I definitely don't want to be ungracious to your family. So I acknowledge the time, right? If we're gonna, because I think this is a good place to kind of round off, and honestly, I think we can come back to this conversation very readily, and I think there's going to be more meat there. But where we're at right now, what is it that you think that? Because we've said a whole lot of things. But I'm kind of curious if we were to repackage this in a more condensed way. Race is what? And where should it be? Because we asked that question earlier, right? And you said, it's kind of like a second, third tier. It's like, okay, in terms of its active place in your life or in mine, that real, genuinely informative kind of place. Where should it be in a perfect world? And how can we better serve those people who are either like or unlike us by fostering that proper place? Do you know do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think I do. And I would say that race needs to be, wherever it's going to be, it needs to be placed under Christ. And not above. And then it also needs to be properly saturated and filtered by Christ being the head, being the apex of a person's identity. I'm not quite sure where it ends up, in terms of its hierarchy, in terms of where it is, but wherever it is, it needs to be downstream of Christ. To be saturated and purified by the living waters.
Okay. So then I guess rather than where should it land is what should it be appropriated to? Something like that, right? Like, because I think you're right. I think it's a better question rather than where should race exist in whatever proper hierarchy of identity. What should it be in relation to? The first answer obviously would be our first allegiance, right? Is not to race. Our first allegiance is to the Christ. Our next allegiance would be to the body, to our own families. There are places where these things are in fact ordinate, right? I think it's similar. Now that you've mentioned it that way, I'm kind of reworking the question in my mind. It would be like asking, where does my love for my wife fit in my identity? The same answer would be true. Under Christ, firmly, right?
Right.
That's not to say that my wife shouldn't be above other things. But my wife is definitely not the end all. And what should my love for my wife bow the knee to? Right. And so if that's the case, my love of my own culture or my own appearance or whatever should be something that I not only allow, but actively intend to be subservient and bow the knee to my allegiance to the Christ. Right.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if that's the proper order that I could put it in, is if my ideas about the importance of my culture or my appearance or skin tone or whatever, if that can be something that comports with Christ's intent for me to be his hands and feet in the earth, if it's something that can not get in the way, but almost lend itself, let's say, to me being another portion of his hands and feet. I'm reminded right now, actually, in a really interesting way, of when we were doing the symbolism of life and death last week. Saint Sean, shout out to Sean, mentioned the idea of God as the light source and a prism as humanity, and
Yep.
then the breaking apart of the light source into its fractals of
Mhm.
individuated color spectrum. And each one of those shades is an expression, not the expression, because the expression is actually the source. Prior to the prism breaks it into its individual portions. It would be like looking at what came out of the prism and throwing a dart at the first color you see and saying, that's the one that represents the source. And all these other ones are kind of like just along for the ride or whatever.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So recognizing that what comes out as an individual expression should be finding its context and value from the fact that it isn't in and of itself a thing. It actually is an expression of something that comes before it. God made man in his image. Man images God. How does he do this? Individually, you image God as Jaylen. Together, right, we image God as brothers, as friends, as comrades, as whatever. And as a community, we image God doing these things. As an entire collective of the body, we image God in doing this. And at every level of resolution, these things should be allowed and intended to align themselves. Right?
Images within images.
Exactly. And so I think that's probably coming back to the same kind of thing. It's like recognizing that if the world and our priorities and our values can be something that are ordered in a proper way, that in that space, because things find their proper order, by the time you get to racial categories, the differences that I have with somebody don't have to distance me from that person.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I think that's what coming back to the touchstone, Christ is the thing that takes all the different pieces and reverses the breaking apart of the spectrum into its individual pieces, draws them back into a unity to point back to the source.
Yes. Bingo.
So Christ is the prism now.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So the Father shines on Christ, and Christ gives these individual expressions of himself. And then if you go from each individual expression and bring them back together, then you come back, and the closer they come together, the closer you actually get back to Christ.
Yep. Bodies that make up a body.
Oh man, I wish Sean was here. That was a brilliant analogy last week, by the way. That was so cool. That's been just fermenting in my mind all week.
That was a bar, Sean.
Oh man, this has been a really fun conversation. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we close out? Because we're approaching the 2-hour mark very quickly.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add other than an identity rooted in the color of one's skin pigmentation is just a really shallow, empty means by which to identify oneself. There's only one method or foundation of identity that is going to last. That's going to be fulfilling. That's going to last. That can be multiplied across time. That can be multiplied and fruitful across time. And that's one rooted in Christ. Everything else is a farce. And it is my hope and my effort to help people to understand that, both those who are white, those who are black, Asian, whatever you are, to identify or to have your identity rooted in that which you have no control over, it's pretty fleeting. It's not gonna. You can't be fruitful and multiplied with this one. It's going to yield to unproductive fruit.
And exactly. Rotten fruit.
Yeah, rotten fruit. There we go.
So as a kind of afterthought, something that I think would be really apt as a closeout is when I was a kid, one of my favorite bands was DC Talk. I'm sure you've heard of that. You've heard of that group, right? I don't know if everybody that I might be dating myself, but I loved DC Talk when I was a kid. I still love them now. I think they're fantastic. I wish that they were still a group. They broke up a long time ago, but they had a song that they released in like the mid 90s. I don't know exactly when it came out, but the mid 90s, they had a song that was called Colored People, right? That title, I think, was particularly chosen because of the fact that it connotes something that even now almost has a negative connotation because it seems isolating. But what they did was almost invert that and made it into something that was rather encapsulating. They said, ultimately, like we're looking at this, and I don't think that we should have these separations. One of the things that they ask in the song is, we've got to come together. Aren't we all human after all? Right. After, again, with some of the thing that we started with was zoom all the way out, human race, right? Not white race, not black race, not Hispanic race, not Asian, not whatever, right? Zoom all the way out, human race, right? One of the things that they wrote in that song that I thought was very, very compelling, even as a kid and as an adult, I find it even more so. It says, "A piece of canvas is only the beginning, for it takes on character with every loving stroke. This is a thing. This thing of beauty is the passion of an artist's heart. By God's design, we are a skin kaleidoscope. We've got to come together. Aren't we all human after all? We're colored people and we live in a tainted place. We're colored people and they call us the human race. We've got a history so full of mistakes, and we're a colored people who depend on a holy grace. Ignorance has wronged some races, and vengeance is the Lord's. If we aspire to share this place, repentance is the cure." I wish I wrote that. Man.
If only, dude. If only you had a pen and paper.
If only I knew how to write that well at like 4 or 5 years old, right?
Yeah, dude. That's all it was.
Oh, my sister said Jaylen may not know he looks like a baby.
Oh dear.
You have a baby face. It's true. You have a very youthful face. I feel like you're going to be a very handsome old man because you have a very young face.
I sure hope so. I'm going to try to be. Oh man, we'll see how that goes.
I know my sister will be pleased that I read of that song by the end of this, because we both loved that song when we were growing up, and I really have been very genuinely impacted by some of the depth of those words. And again, I'm a sucker for good lyricism and I love poetry. So when somebody can use words as tools to say something like that, I wish I had written that. But man, just to read it or recite it out loud is enough to make my heart feel so full.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I'm sure you salivate over the Psalms then, huh?
Oh yeah. Oh dude. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And to be honest with you, I like over a lot of Paul's writings too, because he has a he has a way with words.
Yeah, that's how I feel about John chapter. That's how I feel about John chapter 1. Like, I can read John chapter 1 every single day, and my jaw will hit the floor like I read it for the first time. Yeah, if as far as I'm concerned, there is no epilogue better than John 1. Nothing.
John 1 is probably one of the coolest chiasms in the Bible. It's definitely God taking just like bending the thing back till it meets the beginning. God, it's beautiful.
You can't, as far as I'm concerned, there is no better writing than John chapter 1.
Can't wait to shake his hand when we get there, huh?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I want to shake the hand that he wrote it with. So whatever hand it was, I want to shake that one.
I bet you John's left-handed.
and I won't care.
Oh man. Yeah, this was super cool. I am very pleased, and I'm so thank you for being an awesome new brother and a friend, but also thank you for joining me on this journey for Cosmic Corner. And I am so happy to see what God has for us this year.
Yeah.
I'm very proud to have you on here as somebody working with me in this capacity, because I think you have a lot to say. And I don't think that many people have done what it is that we're doing with Cosmic Corner to allow for thought to expand and grow organically this way, and kind of just explore things without needing to open up by saying, I'm right, you should listen, agree with me.
Sure.
So I'm very happy to be able to do this with you. I'm glad I like welcome on board. Seriously. I'm so pleased
absolutely.
right now.
Hey man, thank you for having me. We talked about this, and I look forward to developing a great bond with you and the Cosmic crew and our listeners, and I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be great. It's going to be.
And I'll work on reworking the intro video to include you, and then we'll have to, maybe you can intro the next episode, huh?
Yeah, maybe. Let's do it.
Right on. You guys heard it. You heard it. Expect Jaylen's going to open the next episode. We do have to talk to Tyler about getting you some StreamYard access, but that's some specialty stuff. That keeps getting neglected and left on the wayside. But
yeah, that's the HR stuff, you know.
Yeah, backdrop. You know, it's all just mechanisms.
Right.
But yeah, if you're still listening right now and you enjoyed this conversation, let us know in the comments down below. I will be reading them, as I'm sure Jaylen also will. If you appreciated this content, please leave a like for us. And if you want to see more, check out the Cosmic Corner playlist on the Faith Unaltered homepage. Hit the playlist tab and scroll down till you see Cosmic Corner, or you can go in the search tab and just type in Cosmic Corner, and our playlist is the first one that pops out. How about that? And so if you like what we're talking about and you want to know more about identity, definitely check out that playlist, because it's become rather expansive, some of the things that we've been able to cover, and I can't wait to expand that even more. What's coming down the pipe for Cosmic Corner coming soon is going to be, let's say, more conversations like this one, but specifically the thing that we're going to be exploring upcoming in the next couple of months is expanding on some of the conversation I had with Alex. If you didn't catch that, check that out in the live tab. It's one of the last videos that popped out, called Sin and Temptation. We're going to be expanding that topic and that thought out a whole lot more by exploring the problem of evil through a more narrative and symbolic lens, to explore the world God had made that is so big and so good that it has room for villainy, and still villainy doesn't win. God wins. So in a world where God wins, villains can have a place because redemption is real. We're going to explore the problem of evil from a lens that makes redemption the reality that it is. And I can't wait to make the devil so mad, bro. But yeah.
Let's go rogue.
Let's go rogue, baby. This has been really fun. I can't wait to go back and listen to this and be baffled by how well it went. Man, yeah, I feel very gratified right now. I feel refreshed. When we got here, not gonna lie, I was stressed. My head was not in a good place, and I was all shook, and I just feel so full right now. So I'm blessed. God answered the prayer that I had before we started this, and I'm just so yes. Oh man, everybody who's listening right now, like the video. If you like it that much, share it with your friends and your family. If you think that we have something that we could have gone over that you'd like to see us talk about that's relevant to this topic, please leave it in the comments. If you don't tell us, we simply don't know. And boy, we are not omniscient. Please let us know if we got a blind spot here. Let us know. Okay? We want to know. We want to correct it. We want to explore further. And we need more eyes And you guys that are listening and watching right now might have something to say that we didn't get to, or might want to hear us explore something that we didn't get to. We're totally willing to do that. So let us know what you think. That being said, it is time. Good night. God bless, and stay like Christ.